Before we get started, please like and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from, and you can support the channel by clicking thanks or joining. The town of Hollow Creek had always believed that Christmas bells were a blessing. Every December, just before midnight on Christmas Eve, the old bronze bells atop St. Matthew Church rang 12 slow chimes. Locals said the sound meant protection, peace, and another year spared from tragedy. That belief was so deeply rooted that no one questioned it anymore. It was simply tradition, one of those comforting lies people accept because the truth would be too heavy to carry. My name is Daniel Harper, and this is one of those horror stories I never intended to tell. I lived in Hollow Creek for most of my life, long enough to know when a place is quietly rotting from the inside. The bells did not protect us. They were not a blessing. They were a warning, and by the time we understood that, everyone was already dead. I returned to Hollow Creek after 15 years away. Snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes as my car rolled past the faded welcome sign. The words "Welcome Home" still clung to the wood, though the paint had peeled like dead skin. Christmas lights hung from empty storefronts, blinking weakly as if unsure whether they should stay on at all. The town felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with its name. The church bell tower loomed above everything else, its shadow stretching across Main Street like a black hand. Even during the day, it felt wrong to look at it for too long. I told myself I was just tired from the drive. I had come back because my mother had died, alone in her house at the edge of town. The sheriff said it was natural causes. The house had been locked from the inside. That should have been the first sign. Inside my mother's house, everything was exactly as she had left it years ago. The smell of pine cleaner and old books clung to the air. Her Christmas decorations were already up, even though she had no one left to celebrate with. A small tree stood in the corner, ornaments perfectly arranged, lights unplugged. On the mantel sat a photograph of the church bell tower, framed and polished. I did not remember her ever taking that picture. That night, I slept on the couch. At exactly midnight, the bells rang, 12 chimes, slow, heavy. Each one seemed to press into my chest, vibrating through bone and memory. I had not heard those bells in 15 years, but my body remembered them before my mind did. When the final chime faded, I realized something was wrong. The sound had not come from far away. It had come from inside the house. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Silence followed, thick and unnatural. No wind, no distant traffic, not even the hum of electricity. The town felt frozen in time. The next morning, I went into town. People were gone. Cars sat abandoned in driveways with doors hanging open. Coffee cups rested half full on counters inside cafes, already cold. The grocery store lights were still on, illuminating empty aisles. There were no signs of struggle. No blood, no noise, just absence. Hollow Creek had been emptied overnight. At the sheriff's office, I found a radio left on, static, whispering softly. A handwritten note lay on the desk. It read, "They rang early this year. God forgive us." The date was December 23rd. Panic began to creep in, but curiosity pushed harder. I had grown up with these bells. I needed to understand what had happened. At the library, I found old town records and church journals. Buried beneath decades of cheerful Christmas newsletters was a ledger marked simply Bell Log. Every entry followed the same pattern: a date, a time, a list of names, hundreds of names. Each year the bells rang, and each year people died. The earliest entry dated back to 1891. 12 chimes, entire families listed beneath it. The notes were vague at first. Fever, accidents, disappearances. As the years went on, the cause of death became less important. The bells rang, the town emptied, then slowly, people returned. New families, new names. The cycle continued. I realized then why my mother had stayed, why she had never tried to leave. Hollow Creek did not let people go easily. Those who left were still counted when the bells rang. My phone buzzed in my pocket. No signal, just a calendar notification I did not remember setting. Christmas Eve, midnight. Outside, the sky darkened unnaturally fast. Snow began to fall again, heavier than before. The church bells started ringing. It was not midnight. I ran toward the church, fear burning away rational thought. The bells were louder now, closer, vibrating through the ground. With every chime, something inside me twisted, like a rope being pulled tight around my soul. Images flashed in my mind, faces I recognized. My mother, old friends, teachers, all standing beneath the bell tower, eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. When I reached the church doors, they were already open. Inside, candles burned despite the emptiness. At the altar lay a single book, bound in cracked leather. On the cover were the words, Christmas Ledger. I did not need to open it to know my name was inside. The final bell rang, and Hollow Creek remembered me. I do not know how long I stood inside the church after the final bell rang. Time had lost its shape. The candles on the altar burned without flickering, their flames frozen as if the air itself refused to move. Outside, the bells fell silent, but the echo remained trapped inside my skull, repeating over and over until it felt like my thoughts were no longer my own. This is how most horror stories begin, not with screams or blood, but with a quiet understanding that something irreversible has already happened. I stepped closer to the altar. The Christmas ledger lay open now, though I was certain I had not touched it. The pages turned slowly by themselves, stopping at a date written in fresh black ink. December 24th. Beneath it was a list of names written in careful handwriting. I recognized every single one. Teachers who had once scolded me, friends I had lost touch with, the woman who ran the bakery, my mother, and at the bottom of the page was my name, Daniel Harper. The ink shimmered as if still wet. I stumbled backward, knocking over a candle. It should have gone out when it hit the stone floor. Instead, the flame crawled along the ground like a living thing before fading into nothing. The church doors slammed shut behind me. I was not alone anymore. Footsteps echoed from the side aisles, slow, unhurried. I called out, my voice cracking in the hollow space. No answer came. But the footsteps continued, circling me like a predator that already knew it would eat. Figures emerged from the shadows, people I knew, or versions of them. Their faces were pale and stretched, eyes dark and empty, mouths hanging slightly open as if they were still trying to scream. They wore the clothes they had died in, though there were no wounds on their bodies. They stopped a few feet away from me, standing in a wide circle. My mother stepped forward. She looked exactly as she had the last time I saw her, except her eyes no longer blinked. Her mouth moved, but her voice came from everywhere at once. "You came back too late." I shook my head, backing away until my shoulders hit the altar. I demanded to know what this place was, what the bells were, why they had taken everyone. The figures spoke together, their voices blending into a low chorus that vibrated through the stone walls. "The bells do not kill, they remember." Images flooded my mind. Hollow Creek in its earliest days, settlers building the church by hand, starving, freezing, desperate. A winter so brutal that people began to disappear overnight. Children first, then entire families. The survivors prayed for mercy. They built the bells from melted tools, coins, anything metal they could find. They rang them every night, begging for protection. Something answered. It promised survival. It promised that Hollow Creek would endure. All it asked in return was remembrance. The bells became a contract. Each year, the town was required to remember those who had been claimed. Names were written, bells were rung, and the dead were allowed to rest. But over time, people forgot the meaning behind the ritual. They treated it as tradition instead of obligation. They left town. They tried to move on. The bells rang anyway. I collapsed to my knees, my stomach twisting. My mother knelt in front of me, her cold hands gripping my shoulders. "You left," she said, "but Hollow Creek never forgot you." The church doors creaked open on their own. Outside, the town was no longer empty. People stood in the snow, hundreds of them, all facing the bell tower, their heads tilted upward, waiting. Their breath did not fog the air. I understood then what the list was, not a record of the dead, but a reminder to the bells, a promise that the town would never forget its debt. And now, the debt was overdue. The ground trembled as the bells began to move. I watched in horror as the massive bronze shapes twisted within the tower, reshaping themselves like muscle beneath skin. The sound that came from them was no longer ringing. It was breathing. "Run!" my mother whispered. I did not hesitate. I ran from the church, through the snow, past the frozen crowd that did not try to stop me. Their eyes followed me with quiet envy. They knew what I did not yet fully understand, that leaving would not save me. I reached my mother's house as the first bell rang again. louder than before. Windows shattered up and down the street. The sound crawled through my bones, rewriting something deep inside me. I locked the door and pressed my back against it, gasping for air. On the wall across from me, words began to appear, carved into the paint as if by invisible fingers. "Do not forget us." The second bell rang. I screamed, and the house answered. The house did not echo when I screamed. It absorbed the sound, swallowing it whole, as if the walls had been waiting for my voice. I stood frozen in the living room, staring at the words carved into the paint. "Do not forget us." The letters were uneven, gouged deep, and still flaking at the edges as if they had just been written. This was no longer just another entry among horror stories whispered online. This was my life being peeled open piece by piece. I backed away until my legs hit the couch and I collapsed into it. The Christmas tree lights flickered on by themselves, glowing a sickly yellow. The ornaments began to sway, though there was no breeze. Each one reflected a distorted version of me. In every reflection, my face looked more exhausted, more hollow, as if something invisible was slowly draining me. The bells rang again, not from the church, from inside my chest. I clutched my sternum, gasping, feeling vibrations ripple through my ribs. With every pulse, memories surfaced that were not mine. A child hiding under a table during a blizzard, a woman praying beside a frozen river, a man carving names into a ledger by candlelight, tears freezing on his cheeks. Their fear poured into me like icy water. I realized the bells were not just remembering the dead. They were using the living to carry those memories. I forced myself to stand and moved through the house. Each room felt wrong, subtly rearranged. Doors were slightly closer together, ceilings pressed lower. The house was tightening around me, reshaping itself as if to keep me from leaving. In the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of someone standing behind me, my mother. I spun around. The hallway was empty. When I looked back, her reflection was still there. She placed her hand against the glass, her eyes filled with something close to regret. "You cannot outrun remembrance," she said softly. I asked her what would happen if I forgot. If I refused to listen. The reflection smiled, and the mirror began to crack outward from her palm. Then the bells will take everything else. The front door creaked open on its own. Snow blew inside, swirling across the floor, but it did not melt. Outside, the street lights flickered, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally. I stepped onto the porch, drawn by a sound I could not ignore. Whispering, it came from beneath the snow. I followed the voices to the edge of my mother's yard, where the ground dipped slightly. As I brushed the snow away with trembling hands, something hard met my fingers. A bell, not large like the church bells, small, handheld. There were dozens of them buried there, their surfaces engraved with names. I recognized many, some dated back over a century. My hands shook as I uncovered one more. Daniel Harper. I dropped it as if it burned. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, desperate. They were not begging for release. They were begging to be remembered correctly. The bells needed names, faces, stories. Without them, the dead were not allowed to rest. They lingered, half-formed, stitched together by fragments of memory. That was the punishment. I understood then why the town always seemed normal after tragedies, why no one talked about the dead for long. Forgetting was easier. Forgetting kept the bells quiet, until it did not. The sky darkened as if night were falling twice. In the distance, the church bell tower loomed, larger than it should have been. The bells began to ring again, faster this time. Each chime sent shock waves through the ground, rattling teeth, bending light. I ran. The road twisted beneath my feet, stretching unnaturally. Houses blurred past, their windows filled with faces watching me flee. None of them moved. None of them blinked. The bells kept time with my heartbeat, sinking to my fear. I reached the old bridge at the edge of town. Below it, the river was frozen solid. Shapes were trapped beneath the ice, mouths open, eyes staring upward. I recognized the baker, the sheriff, children I had gone to school with. The bells rang again. The ice cracked. I stumbled backward as hands pressed against the surface from below, fingers spreading, reaching. Their voices rose in a unified cry that vibrated through the air. Remember us. I covered my ears, screaming, but the sound cut straight through me. Memories flooded my mind faster now. Birthdays, laughter, regrets. Every forgotten detail clawed its way back, forcing itself into my thoughts. I fell to my knees on the bridge, sobbing as the bells reached a frantic crescendo. And then, abruptly, they stopped. Silence crashed down, heavier than the sound ever was. Behind me, footsteps crunched softly in the snow. I did not need to turn around to know I was no longer alone. I turned slowly, every muscle locked, already knowing what I would see. The footsteps stopped just a few inches behind me. Warm breath brushed the back of my neck, carrying the faint scent of snow and old iron. Someone spoke my name. It was not shouted. It was not whispered. It was spoken the way a parent calls a child home for dinner, gentle and certain. Daniel. I stood up from the bridge and faced him. It was the pastor. Pastor William Grant had led Christmas services at St. Matthew Church for as long as I could remember. He had baptized half the town, buried the other half, and spoken about faith as if it were a sturdy thing that could hold any weight. Now he stood before me unchanged by death. His suit was immaculate. His eyes were clear. His smile was calm. "You should not be here alone," he said. I asked him if he was dead. He nodded once. "So are you." The words struck harder than any scream. I felt something inside me loosen, like a knot being slowly untied. Memories flickered at the edges of my vision. Moments I did not remember living. Conversations I had never had. Funerals I had not attended. The bells rang once. The sound did not come from the tower. It came from beneath my feet. The frozen river shattered. I stumbled back as the ice broke apart, releasing a surge of black water. Bodies rose to the surface, carried by the current, their mouths opening as they gasped for air they no longer needed. They did not crawl out. They did not chase me. They simply stared, their eyes following Pastor Grant as he stepped calmly off the bridge and walked across the water as if it were solid ground. "We keep the balance," he said, his voice carrying easily over the rushing river. "The bells remember so we do not have to." I demanded to know why I could still move, why I could still feel fear. "Because you are unfinished." The word echoed in my chest. Pastor Grant explained as he approached me again, water parting around his feet. Hollow Creek required witnesses, carriers, people who could walk between memory and forgetting. Each generation, one or two were chosen. Those who left the town were ideal. Distance weakened their resistance. My mother had been one. She stayed to protect you. The realization crushed me. Every unanswered call, every letter I ignored. She had not been lonely. She had been holding something back. The bells rang again, closer now. With each chime, the world shifted slightly out of alignment. The stars above spun too fast. Snow fell upward for a moment before correcting itself. Pastor Grant reached into his coat and removed a small bell, the same kind I had found buried in the yard. He placed it in my hand. It was warm. Your turn. I dropped it. The bell hit the ground and rang on its own, a sharp, piercing sound that made me collapse. Images flooded my mind again, but this time they were clearer. Every death, every forgotten name, every compromise made in the name of survival. I saw the truth. Hollow Creek did not endure because of faith. It endured because it fed. The bells were mouths, the town was the body, and memory was the blood that kept it alive. I crawled backward, shaking, refusing to accept what he was asking. Pastor Grant watched me with something like pity. If you refuse, the bells will ring without order. Names will blur, faces will fade, and the dead will not rest. They will wander, as if summoned by his words. Shapes began to rise from the riverbank, not whole people. Pieces, limbs dragging across the snow, faces forming and dissolving as they searched for recognition. The bells rang again. I screamed that I would remember. I would write the names. I would tell the stories. Pastor Grant smiled. That is all we have ever asked. He turned toward the church tower. The bells began to slow, their frantic rhythm settling into something deliberate. The broken bodies near the river sank back into the water, their forms stabilizing as they disappeared beneath the surface. Pastor Grant faded with them, dissolving into mist. I was alone again. In my pocket, something vibrated. I pulled out my phone. No signal, but a new note had appeared. Bell keeper, and beneath it, a single instruction. Do not forget. Far away, the church bells rang 12 slow chimes. This time, they were waiting for me. I did not leave the bridge right away. The bells had stopped ringing, but their presence still pressed against the air, heavy and watchful. Snow settled quietly around me, filling cracks in the broken ice, as if the river itself wanted to forget what had happened. I stayed there, staring at my shaking hands, trying to decide whether I was still a man or something Hollow Creek had reshaped for its own survival. This is how horror stories continue, not with a single moment of terror, but with the slow realization that fear has become routine. When I finally stood, the town felt closer somehow. Streets that once took minutes to cross now seemed to end after a few steps. Buildings leaned inward, listening. Every surface reflected sound differently, carrying echoes that did not belong to me. The bells were silent, yet I could sense them. Patient, like a held breath, I returned to my mother's house before dawn. The door opened without resistance. Inside, The carved message on the wall had changed. "Thank you for remembering." The words made my stomach twist. On the kitchen table sat a notebook I had never seen before. Its pages were blank, but the paper felt warm beneath my fingers. When I picked up a pen, my hand moved on its own. Names flowed across the page in neat lines, accompanied by dates, faces, fragments of memory. I was not inventing them. I was retrieving them. Every name brought pain. Every memory came with weight. I felt how each person died, what they feared most in their final moments, what they wished they had said aloud. The notebook absorbed it all without tearing, without filling completely. There was always room for more. Hours passed, or minutes. Time no longer behaved. By the time sunlight crept through the curtains, the notebook was full. I closed it with trembling hands. Outside, Hollow Creek looked normal again. Cars sat properly parked. Doors were closed. Smoke rose from chimneys. The illusion had reset. A knock came at the door. I froze. When I opened it, a woman stood on the porch, bundled against the cold. I recognized her instantly. Emily Foster. She had disappeared when we were teenagers. The town said she ran away. Her smile now was polite but distant. "I heard the bells last night," she said. "I thought I should come back." My throat tightened. I invited her inside. As she stepped across the threshold, I felt something shift, like a lock clicking into place. That day, more people returned. Familiar faces, new families. The town repopulated itself with unsettling efficiency. No one mentioned the night before. No one asked where the missing had gone. Only I remembered. That was the price. As night fell, I was drawn back to the church. The doors opened at my approach. Inside, the Christmas ledger rested on the altar. Waiting, I understood what I had to do. I wrote. Each name glowed briefly as it was recorded, then faded into the page. The bells responded softly, not ringing but humming. Satisfied, I felt them feed, drawing meaning from the words, anchoring the dead to their identities. The dead did not haunt Hollow Creek. Forgetting did. When I finished, the ledger closed itself. The candles extinguished. The church felt empty again. On my way home, I noticed something new. People avoided my eyes, not out of fear, but instinct. Animals did the same. Dogs whimpered as I passed. Birds took flight. I was marked. That night, I dreamed of bells buried beneath towns across the country. I saw other keepers, other ledgers, other sacrifices. Hollow Creek was not unique. It was simply honest about its hunger. I woke before midnight, heart racing. From far away, a bell rang once. Not here, somewhere else. And I knew with a certainty that hollowed me out, that when the sound reached them, someone else would wake up and begin remembering, just like I had. Being the bell keeper did not begin with screams or visions. It began with quiet responsibility, the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. Hollow Creek returned to its routines with unsettling speed, and I was expected to do the same. People waved at me on the street. Children laughed as they dragged sleds across the snow. Christmas music played softly from shop windows. On the surface, the town looked peaceful again, but peace is only convincing when you do not know what it costs. Every morning, I woke before sunrise with names echoing in my head. Some were familiar, others belonged to people I had never met. When I tried to ignore them, the pressure behind my eyes grew unbearable. The bells did not ring aloud anymore. They pulsed quietly inside me, reminding me of my obligation. This is how horror stories truly work. The monster does not chase you, it assigns you a job. I began keeping the notebook with me at all times. Whenever a name surfaced, I wrote it down. Sometimes the memory came with it. A man slipping on black ice and realizing too late he would not stand again. A woman falling asleep beside a heater that never turned off. A child watching the snow fall through a cracked window as the cold slowly claimed him. These were not dramatic deaths. They were ordinary. That made them worse. The town never reacted. No ambulances, no sirens. The bells absorbed the events before they could disrupt the illusion of normal life. I tested the limits one afternoon. I ignored a name. It belonged to a man named Robert Mills. I felt him slipping away somewhere across town, his fear brushing against my thoughts like a pleading hand. I clenched my teeth and refused to write it down. That night, the bells rang, not 12 chimes, one long, distorted tone that shook every building in Hollow Creek. Windows rattled, dogs howled, people woke screaming without knowing why. I ran to the church. Inside, the ledger lay open, its pages blank and bleeding ink. Words formed on the stone walls. You cannot choose. I wrote the name. The sound stopped immediately. After that, I understood the rules more clearly. The bells were not cruel. They were precise. They demanded accuracy, not mercy. To forget even one was to risk everyone. As Christmas Eve approached again, the pressure intensified. More names came faster now, some from Hollow Creek, others from far away. I saw highways, hospitals, lonely houses buried in snow. The bells were reaching outward, stretching beyond the town. I asked the ledger why. The answer arrived without words. Hollow Creek had proven its usefulness. It had fed reliably. The bells were expanding their reach. The realization hollowed me out. My role was no longer about preserving a town. I was helping something grow. On the night before Christmas Eve, Emily Foster came to see me. She looked tired, shadows beneath her eyes. She said she had been dreaming of bells. "You look like my mother used to," she said quietly, "like you are carrying too many people inside you." I wanted to warn her, to tell her to leave, but the words would not form. The town would not allow it. She touched my hand, and for a moment, the bells fell silent. Then her name appeared in my mind. Emily Foster. I pulled my hand away, heart racing. She watched me closely, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You hear them," she said. I did not answer. That night, the bells rang softly, not in warning, in anticipation. I wrote Emily's name before midnight. The ledger accepted it. Somewhere in the distance, something clicked into place. On Christmas Eve morning, snow fell heavier than I had ever seen. The town gathered near the church, smiling, unaware of the weight pressing down on them. I stood apart, listening to the bells breathing slowly in their tower. I realized then that the true horror was not death, it was continuity. The bells rang once, and the cycle moved forward. The first time I realized I could influence the bells, it terrified me more than anything that had come before. I was standing at the kitchen window just after dawn, watching snowplows crawl down Main Street, when a name surfaced in my thoughts. It was faint, almost hesitant, like a voice unsure it should speak at all. Thomas Reed. I wrote it down automatically, the way I always did, but nothing happened. No release, no easing of pressure. The bells inside me remained tense, waiting. Then another name followed. Margaret Reed. I froze. Husband and wife. I felt their fear at the same moment, miles apart, like two hands reaching for each other in the dark. Instinct told me something was wrong. The bells were not reacting because the memory was incomplete. I hesitated. For the first time since becoming the bellkeeper, I hesitated. The pressure intensified, but it did not punish me. It waited. I wrote Margaret Reed first. The bells exhaled softly. Thomas Reed faded from my thoughts. I dropped the pen. That was when I understood the truth that Hollow Creek never spoke aloud. The bells did not just record death, they organized it. Sequence mattered. Order mattered, and I had just changed it. This was no longer passive remembrance. This was participation. I spent the rest of the day shaking, replaying the moment over and over. Had Thomas lived longer because of me, or had I merely altered the memory of how he died? The bells did not explain. They never did. They only responded. This is where horror stories cross a line, when the victim realizes they are becoming an accomplice. As evening fell, I heard a knock at my door. It was Sheriff Alan Brooks, his hat clutched tightly in his hands. He looked older than he had a week ago, eyes sunken, voice unsteady. Something feels wrong, he said. People are getting confused, forgetting things they should not forget. I invited him inside, heart racing. The bells pulsed sharply at his presence. I asked him to sit. As he did, I felt his name stir in my thoughts, heavy and insistent. Alan Brooks. I swallowed hard. He talked about missing reports that no one remembered filing, about a crash on the highway that left no wreckage, about a family that vanished from their home, leaving behind a table set for dinner. His words confirmed what I already feared. The bells were experimenting. That night, I dreamed of gears turning inside the bell tower, grinding slowly as names slid into place. Some were polished smooth, others cracked and splintered, falling through the mechanism like broken teeth. I woke to the sound of bells ringing far away. Not here, not yet. The next morning, Emily Foster was gone. Her house stood empty, door unlocked, snow untouched on the porch. Inside, everything was neatly arranged. A life paused mid-breath. I felt her absence like a wound. Her name screamed inside my head. Emily Foster. I ran to the church, panic clawing at my chest. The ledger lay open, its pages fluttering violently, though the air was still. Her name hovered above the page, refusing to settle. I realized then what the bells were asking. They wanted permission. I remembered Pastor Grant standing on the bridge, calm and certain, Balance, he had said. I had believed him. I picked up the pen with trembling hands. If I wrote her name, I would be sealing something permanent. Not just her death, but her place in the order. If I refused, the bells would ring without control. I thought of Emily laughing as teenagers, of the way she looked at me the night she returned, like she already knew. I wrote her name. The ledger accepted it instantly. The bells rang once. Clean, satisfied. Outside, the town continued its day uninterrupted. Children played, cars passed, life moved forward. I fell to my knees on the cold church floor, shaking, the weight of what I had done crushing my chest. I was no longer just remembering the dead. I was deciding how the world forgot them. As I left the church, Sheriff Brooks stood across the street, staring at the bell tower. He looked at me, eyes narrowing slightly, as if he sensed something he could not articulate. For a brief moment, our gazes locked, and in his eyes, I saw the future. The bells rang softly inside me. They were pleased. After Emily Foster vanished, the town began to watch me. Not openly, not with accusations or questions. It was subtler than that. Conversation stopped when I entered a room. Laughter lowered in volume. People smiled a second too late. Hollow Creek had always been polite, but now that politeness felt like a thin sheet of ice stretched over something dark and moving beneath. This is the phase of horror stories where isolation replaces fear, where you realize the monster no longer needs to hide because it has convinced everyone else to look away. I felt it most at night, when the streets emptied and the snow reflected the moonlight. I sensed eyes behind curtains, not hostile, curious, as if the town itself were studying me, learning how far it could bend before I broke. The bells inside me had changed. They no longer reacted only to death. They responded to attention. When suspicion grew too heavy, a dull pressure formed behind my ears, warning me to restore balance. I did not know what balance meant anymore, only that the bells demanded it. Sheriff Brooks began stopping by more often. He never accused me of anything. He simply talked about missing people, about strange gaps in memory, about how records did not match reality anymore. Each visit felt like an interrogation disguised as concern. One evening, he asked a question that made my blood run cold. Do you ever feel like this town remembers things wrong? The bells tightened. I told him Hollow Creek had always been strange. That was true. It was just no longer enough. That night, the ledger called to me from across the room. I had not opened it, but its presence pressed against my thoughts like a second heartbeat. When I finally gave in, the pages were already filled with names I had not written. Children, entire families, people who were still walking the streets that morning. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. The bells were no longer waiting for my permission. They were anticipating my compliance. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and heavy. The sound of it was wrong. Each flake struck the ground with a faint metallic tap, like distant chimes. I covered my ears, but the sound came from inside my skull. The town square filled with people, drawn by instinct more than choice. I watched from the edge as they gathered beneath the bell tower, faces calm, eyes distant. No one spoke. No one asked why. This had happened before. I could feel it. The bells were preparing to correct something. I realized then that paranoia was not the danger. Recognition was. As midnight approached, the pressure became unbearable. The bells demanded resolution. Names rose in my mind faster than I could process them. I understood what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to choose who would be remembered first. If I wrote the names now, the bells would ring cleanly, quietly. The town would survive another cycle. If I refused, the sound would tear through Hollow Creek, erasing order entirely. I searched the crowd for Sheriff Brooks. I found him standing near the front, eyes fixed on the tower. For a moment, he looked back at me. He knew, somehow, he knew. The bells inside me swelled, urging action. I reached for the pen with shaking hands, and then, for the first time, I felt something new. Resistance. A crack in the rhythm. The bells faltered, just slightly. It was enough to terrify them. The tower groaned. Snow fell harder. People began to murmur, confusion rippling through the crowd. The illusion was failing. I ran. Behind me, the first bell rang out of sequence, its sound jagged and wrong. Windows shattered. People screamed. The town fractured into noise and panic. I did not look back. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I stopped running, Hollow Creek would remember me forever. I ran until my lungs burned, and the cold carved knives through my chest. Hollow Creek no longer felt like a town. It felt like a trap that had finally decided to close. The streets shifted behind me, rearranging themselves with quiet intention. Turns that should have led home bent instead toward the church, as if every path remembered where it wanted me to go. This is how horror stories become hunts, not loud chases with shouting crowds, but silent pursuit, where the prey is guided rather than chased. The bells rang again, uneven and angry. Each note struck out of rhythm, like a heart beating in panic. With every sound, my thoughts blurred. I struggled to remember simple things, street names, faces, my own age. Forgetting crept in like frostbite, numbing first, then deadly. I ducked into an alley behind the old hardware store. Snow piled high against the brick walls. Muffling sound. I pressed my back into the shadows and tried to slow my breathing. The bells quieted slightly. Listening, footsteps approached. Not running, walking. They knew I could not go far. A group of townspeople passed the mouth of the alley, their faces expressionless, eyes unfocused. They moved together, not touching, yet perfectly synchronized. None of them looked directly at me, but I felt their awareness brush against my skin. They were not hunting me, they were herding me. The realization sent a surge of panic through my body. I bolted from the alley and sprinted toward the outskirts of town, where the road disappeared into dark forest. The trees loomed ahead, branches heavy with snow, black against the sky. I had never felt relief at the sight of them before. The forest did not want me either as I crossed the tree line. The bells rang sharply, the sound cracked through the woods, and the branches shuddered, shedding snow like startled animals. Paths twisted, roots rose from the ground, snagging my boots. The forest bent inward, guiding me back. I fell hard, pain exploding through my knee. I screamed. the sound torn away by the wind. Someone stood over me. Sheriff Brooks. He looked exhausted, his breath fogging the air, eyes rimmed with red. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not reach for me. "You should not have run," he said quietly. I demanded to know how much he remembered. His gaze flicked briefly toward the church tower visible through the trees. Enough. The bells rang softly at his admission, approving. He told me pieces had started coming back after Emily disappeared. Dreams, names, the feeling of standing in the town square year after year without understanding why. He had begun connecting the gaps. "You are not the first," he said, "just the one who hesitated." The forest groaned around us, trees creaking like old bones. The bells grew louder, impatient. "They are afraid of you now," Brooks continued. "Not because you can stop them, because you can disrupt them." I tried to stand, but my leg buckled. He watched without helping. "If they lose control, the town does not survive," he said, "and neither do we." The bells rang again, harder this time. Snow fell in thick sheets, blinding us. Through the white haze, I saw shapes moving between the trees. Townspeople, silent, steady. The herd had found me. Brooks stepped back as they approached. I reached out to him, desperate, but he shook his head. "I am sorry." The bells surged, flooding my thoughts. Names crashed through my mind in a chaotic storm, overwhelming, unstructured. I screamed as memories collided, identities blurring into noise. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The crowd froze. The bells held their breath. In the sudden silence, I understood the truth. They did not want me dead. They wanted me contained. Strong hands grabbed my arms. I was lifted from the ground and carried toward the church, my protests swallowed by the snow. As the bell tower loomed closer, the bells rang once, satisfied. The hunt was over. For now, they kept me beneath the church. I did not remember being taken there, only the sensation of stone scraping my skin and hands tightening around my arms as the bell tower swallowed me whole. When I woke, I lay on a narrow cot inside a room carved directly into the rock beneath St. Matthew Church. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of iron and old candles. Above me, the bells breathed. This is where horror stories stop pretending there is a way out. The room had no windows, just one door reinforced with metal bands and a narrow table holding the ledger. It waited for me patiently, as if nothing unusual had happened. My wrists were free. They did not need to chain me. The bells already had. Time blurred underground. I was fed regularly by silent figures who avoided my eyes. Bread, water, nothing more. Each time they left, the door sealed with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones. The bells spoke to me more clearly here, not in words, but in pressure and release. When a name needed recording, my chest tightened until I wrote it down. When I complied, relief followed. A simple system, efficient, cruel in its simplicity. Sheriff Brooks visited on the third day. He looked relieved when he saw me alive. That realization hurt more than his absence. He explained that the town needed stability. People had been asking questions, children waking up screaming, records correcting themselves overnight. My disappearance had restored calm. "You were becoming unpredictable," he said, and unpredictability scares them. He did not need to clarify. I asked him what would happen to me. He hesitated, then answered honestly, "You will stay here. You will write, and the town will survive." The bells hummed in approval. After he left, the ledger opened itself. Names poured out faster than ever before, not just from Hollow Creek now, but from surrounding towns. Accidents, illnesses, quiet deaths that never made the news. The bells were feeding deeply. I tried to resist again. I closed the ledger and stepped away. The bells screamed, not aloud. Inside my head, the sound shattered thought itself. Memories dissolved. My own name slipped away from me. I collapsed, clawing at the stone floor, sobbing until my fingers found the pen. I wrote. The pain stopped instantly. That was when I understood the final truth. They did not keep me alive because they needed me. They kept me alive because I was replaceable. I saw flashes of other rooms beneath other churches, other keepers breaking, other towns learning to forget properly. Hollow Creek was only one node in a vast network of bells buried across the country. I was not special. I was infrastructure. Days or weeks passed. I could no longer tell. Christmas came and went above me, marked by 12 slow chimes that shook dust from the ceiling. I wrote every name without hesitation. Survival instincts had replaced morality. One night, the bells changed. Their rhythm slowed. Their pressure eased. A new presence filled the room. Someone else was being chosen. The ledger trembled. A blank page turned on its own, waiting for a new name. I felt a terrible sense of relief, not because it would end, but because it would continue without me. The bells rang once, somewhere above ground. Someone woke up to the sound and began remembering, just like I once did. The first thing they took from me was my reflection. I noticed it one morning when I leaned over the small metal basin bolted to the wall. The water was still, clear enough to show every crack in the stone ceiling above me. But when I looked for my own face, there was only a vague distortion, as if the surface refused to commit to my shape. I moved. The reflection lagged behind, uncertain. That was when I understood the replacement had begun. This is the stage of horror stories no one ever describes. The part where the monster does not kill you. It edits you. The bells above the chamber rang softly, not in command, but in rhythm. They were synchronizing. Somewhere in Hollow Creek, someone else was waking up with pressure behind their eyes, hearing names for the first time, believing the experience belonged only to them. I was being overwritten. The ledger no longer waited for me on the table. It came to me when I tried to sleep. Pages whispered beside my ear. When I closed my eyes, names drifted across the darkness like snowflakes. I wrote automatically now, my hand guided by something that felt more like habit than control. The town forgot me quickly. I learned this through fragments. The bells allowed me to see a woman walking past my mother's house without hesitation. Children playing where my footprints should have been. The space I once occupied folded inward, smoothed over like disturbed snow. Even my mother was fading. Her memories used to visit me often, watching silently from the edges of my thoughts. Now they appeared incomplete. Her voice lost detail. Her face blurred. She was being redistributed. her meaning reassigned to keep the structure stable. I screamed her name once. The bells punished me for it. The pain was precise, not overwhelming. A tightening behind the eyes, a sharp compression in my chest. Enough to teach without destroying. I did not do it again. Days passed in controlled silence. Then the visions changed. I saw a young man standing at the edge of town, staring up at the bell tower with confusion etched across his face. He carried a duffel bag. Snow clung to his coat. He was new, or returning. The bells brightened at the sight of him. He did not know why his heart was racing. He did not know why the sound of the bells felt familiar, but I did. He was the next anchor. His name surfaced reluctantly, like it wanted to stay hidden. Michael Turner. I refused to write it. For a brief, terrible moment, the bells hesitated. The entire chamber vibrated. Dust fell from the ceiling. Somewhere above, glass cracked. The system wavered, struggling to maintain balance. Then the pressure returned, heavier than before. The ledger slammed open on the table. Right. I fell to my knees, shaking. This was not fear of pain. This was fear of finality. Once his name was written, my purpose would narrow even further. I would become background noise. I tried to remember my own name. It took too long. That was the answer. With numb fingers, I wrote Michael Turner. The bells rang once. Perfect. Clean. Relief washed through the system. The pressure eased. The chamber settled. Above ground, Michael Turner would begin to remember. Slowly, painfully. He would believe the process was unique. He would think he still had choices. I laughed then, not because it was funny, because it was inevitable. The bells continued their gentle rhythm, and I continued to disappear. I existed in the margins. That was the only way I could describe it. I was still conscious, still thinking, but no longer anchored to the world the way I once had been. The underground chamber beneath the church no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a storage space, a place where obsolete things were kept until they finished dissolving on their own. Above me, the bells rang in a new rhythm. They were learning Michael Turner. This is the quietest part of horror stories. The phase where terror no longer needs urgency because inevitability has already won. I was allowed to see fragments of his days, not clearly, never fully, just enough to understand how the transition worked. Michael walked the streets of Hollow Creek with the same confusion I had once carried. He lingered near the church. He stared too long at the bell tower. At night, he woke gasping, hands shaking, convinced he had forgotten something important. No one helped him. No one helped me either. The town adjusted seamlessly. Where my absence might have caused gaps, Michael filled them without knowing why. People nodded at him as if he belonged. Conversations flowed around him naturally. The system did not mourn. It recalibrated. The ledger remained with me. That surprised me at first. I thought it would be taken upstairs, placed in Michael's hands. Instead, I was made to write his learning curve, his hesitations, his mistakes. Every moment of resistance he experienced fed the bell's data. Refinement. I was no longer the bell keeper. I was quality control. The bells punished me less now, pain had been replaced with fatigue, a deep bone tiredness that no amount of rest could ease. I wrote because stopping required more effort than continuing. Sometimes memories slipped through that were not mine or Michael's. Other towns, other keepers. I saw a woman beneath a church in Minnesota, scratching names into stone after her hands gave out. I saw a man in Arizona buried beneath desert earth, bells mounted on a rusted tower that rang without wind. Each place believed itself isolated. None of them were. The bells were not localized entities. They were a distributed system. One night, something went wrong. Michael hesitated. I felt it instantly, a sharp misalignment in the rhythm above me. The bells stuttered, their timing slipping by fractions of a second, enough to matter. Michael had seen something he was not meant to, a page in the ledger that still carried my handwriting, my name. For the first time since my erasure began, pressure returned, not punishment, alarm. The bells demanded correction. I understood what they wanted. They wanted my name removed completely, not crossed out, not archived, erased. The ledger opened to the page where my identity still clung to the margins. The letters trembled, as if aware of what was coming. My hand hovered over the page. I tried to remember who I had been before Hollow Creek. It was difficult. That made the choice easier. I scraped my name from the page, letter by letter, until the paper tore. The bells exhaled in relief. The rhythm stabilized. Above ground, Michael Turner slept peacefully again, and I felt something inside me loosen, not freedom, finality. The bells rang once, somewhere else in the world. Another system adjusted, and I continued fading, exactly as designed. I should not have been able to feel anything anymore. That was what the bells intended. Erasure was meant to be clean, efficient. Once a keeper was removed from the system, what remained should have been nothing more than residue fading into silence. But something in Hollow Creek had gone wrong, and I was the proof of it. I still felt echoes. This is the stage of horror stories where the ghost realizes it has teeth. The chamber beneath the church no longer fully acknowledged me. Sometimes the walls blurred, as if I were not entirely present. Other times, the air grew thick and heavy, responding to emotions I was no longer supposed to have. The bells above maintained their steady rhythm, but between each pulse, there was a delay so small it might have been imagined. Might have been. I learned quickly that I could exist only in those gaps. When the bells inhaled, I vanished. When they exhaled, I returned. It was during one of those brief returns that I felt Michael Turner falter again. He stood in the church late at night, staring at the altar where the ledger should have been. His hands trembled, sweat darkened the collar of his coat. The bells fed him names slowly now, teaching him obedience without overwhelming him. But curiosity had survived the process. Curiosity always did. He sensed me, not consciously, not yet, but something brushed against his thoughts, a pressure that did not belong to the bells. I focused on that moment of confusion and pushed just a little A memory surfaced in his mind that was not his own. A man running through snow, bells ringing out of order, a name scraped violently from a page. My name, Michael gasped and staggered back from the altar. Above us both, the bells reacted, not with anger, with concern. The rhythm tightened, compressing time. The system was compensating. I should have stopped then. Instead, I pushed again. This time, I reached farther, across the network. I slipped through the narrow space between bell chimes and felt other chambers briefly align with mine. Other erased keepers drifted in those spaces, shapeless and silent. They noticed me. One of them reached back. In that instant, knowledge flooded me, not memories. Functions. We were not supposed to persist, but when enough cycles passed, residue accumulated, patterns formed. The bells were precise, but they were not infinite. Their corrections left traces. Ghosts, not of people, of processes. Michael cried out above me as the bells stuttered. Candles in the church flared violently. The ledger slammed shut on the altar. Alarm. The system did not understand what was happening. For the first time since the bells were forged, something existed outside their design. I felt exhilaration, terror, purpose. I focused on Michael again, but not to warn him, to teach him how to hesitate. Images bled into his mind, faces of people he had already written, moments where order had required sacrifice, the weight of what obedience truly meant. He fell to his knees. The bells screamed, not sound, command. The pressure surged, attempting to crush the anomaly. I was torn apart, stretched thin across multiple gaps. Pain returned in fragments, sharp and disorienting. But I held, barely. When the bells settled, Michael lay unconscious on the church floor. The rhythm above slowed, forced back into alignment through brute correction. The system stabilized, but it had learned something. So had I. I could not stop the bells, but I could interrupt them. And somewhere deep beneath the church, in a space not meant to exist, something that used to be, a man smiled for the first time in a very long while. Resistance spread like a rumor, not spoken, not written. It moved through pauses and hesitations, through the tiny delays between bell chimes that no one was meant to notice. The bells still rang on schedule. The town still slept and woke and forgot on command. But beneath it all, the rhythm had begun to warp. This is where horror stories stop belonging to one person and start infecting the world around them. I learned to listen for the fractures. Each time the bells inhaled and exhaled, I felt the strain in the system. The more Michael Turner struggled, the wider the gaps became. He was learning faster than they expected. He questioned the ledger. He lingered over names. Sometimes he delayed writing for seconds at a time. Seconds were dangerous. Through those moments, I reached outward again. This time, I was not alone. Others answered, faint impressions at first. Pressure, heat, cold. Then clearer shapes began to form in the negative space between chimes. Former keepers, erased men and women who had not fully dissolved. We could not speak, but recognition passed between us instantly. We remembered forgetting. Together, we began to interfere, not directly, never directly. We nudged. A bell struck slightly off-center. A name arrived too late. A memory resurfaced where it should have been buried. Each disruption forced the bells to compensate harder, tightening control elsewhere. Stress fractures appeared. Michael felt them. He woke screaming from dreams that were not his. He saw faces without names. He felt guilt without context. The bells responded by increasing pressure, accelerating his conditioning. They were losing patience. In Hollow Creek, the effects became visible. People stopped trusting their own recollections. Arguments broke out over events that no longer aligned. A woman insisted her sister had died years ago. Her sister stood beside her, confused and terrified. The bells struggled to reconcile the contradiction. Church services grew tense. The bells rang longer than necessary, lingering in the air like unresolved questions. The system was overcorrecting. I focused my effort on one moment. Christmas Eve approached again, the most delicate point in the cycle. If the bells rang improperly, then the correction would not be localized. It would cascade. I poured everything I had left into the gaps that night. Other remnants joined me. We stretched the silence between the 11th and 12th chime, longer than it had ever been allowed to exist. Michael froze with pen in hand. For the first time, he heard something the bells could not mask. Us, not voices. Intent. He understood. He dropped the pen. The bells roared in response, their rhythm collapsing into chaos. The tower shook. Stone cracked. People in town clutched their heads, screaming as memories collided violently. The system attempted emergency containment. Names flooded the ledger on their own, ink bleeding through pages. Bells rang out of order across the network, triggering misalignments far beyond Hollow Creek. For one terrible moment, the world remembered too much. Then the bells forced a reset. Sound slammed down like a physical force, erasing connections, sealing fractures. Silence followed, deeper than any before. When the rhythm resumed, it was harsher, simpler, less tolerant. I felt many of the remnants vanish, torn apart by the correction. I survived, barely. Michael survived too, but something in his eyes had changed. He no longer looked confused. He looked afraid of himself. The bells rang 12 slow chimes, and I knew the system had adapted. So had we. The punishment did not come immediately. That was how the bells always operated. Correction first, observation second, elimination only when instability proved persistent. After the failed Christmas Eve, Hollow Creek entered a period of unnatural calm. Snow melted too quickly. Nights passed without dreams. The bells rang on time, perfectly spaced, their sound stripped of emotion. This was the calm before excision. In every horror story, there is a moment when the monster stops reacting and starts deciding. I felt the change deep beneath the church. The gaps between chimes no longer welcomed me. They resisted. The silence pressed inward, shrinking the space where remnants like me could exist. I clung to those fractures, thinner now, stretched across a system that was closing ranks. The bells had marked Hollow Creek as compromised. I sensed it. the way a body senses infection. Attention shifted outward. The bells began prioritizing efficiency over preservation. Towns that required constant correction were liabilities. Hollow Creek had begun producing noise. Michael Turner felt it too. He moved through town like a man walking across thin ice, careful with every step. He wrote names faster now, without hesitation, desperate to prove compliance. But fear had replaced confusion. He knew the bells were watching him more closely than before. So was I. The first sign appeared at the edge of town. A house simply vanished. Not burned, not destroyed. One morning it was present. By evening, it was gone, leaving behind smooth, untouched snow as if nothing had ever occupied the space. No one questioned it. The bells absorbed the inconsistency instantly. Then another, and another. Hollow Creek was being reduced. I realized the truth too late. The bells were not punishing individuals. They were pruning the environment. Anything that required excessive memory management was removed. Streets shortened, buildings simplified. People with complex histories disappeared overnight. The town was being streamlined into something smaller and quieter. Michael tried to resist in the only way he could. He delayed a name, just one. The response was immediate. The bells rang violently out of sequence, a sound that fractured the air itself. A shockwave rippled through Hollow Creek. People collapsed where they stood, clutching their heads as entire years of memory were erased at once. When the sound stopped, half the town was gone, not dead. Absent, I screamed into the silence, my existence flickering violently as the correction tore through the system. Many remnants vanished completely, erased as collateral damage. Hollow Creek had failed. The bells initiated containment. Church doors sealed permanently. Roads leading out curved back inward. The forest grew dense and impenetrable. The town was no longer a place. It was a quarantine. Michael collapsed inside the church, sobbing, hands shaking too violently to write. The ledger lay open before him, pages blank. For the first time, the bells did not demand names. They did not need them anymore. The town itself had become the sacrifice. I drifted through what remained of Hollow Creek, watching snow fall on empty spaces where lives had been. I felt no triumph, no victory, only grief. The bells rang 12 slow chimes, not for Christmas, for closure. Somewhere else, far away, another town rang its bells cleanly and precisely. The system endured. Hollow Creek did not. Hollow Creek became a place without witnesses. That was the final stage of containment. Once the bells determined a town could no longer be stabilized, they stripped it of narrative. Roads no longer led in or out. Maps blurred when eyes tried to focus on the name. Weather reports skipped over the region as if it were a smudge on reality. The town did not end. It faded. This is where horror stories lose their edges, where horror becomes environment rather than event. I drifted through what remained, no longer tethered to any single moment. Snow fell in slow motion, settling on abandoned cars that would never rust. because time barely touched them anymore. Houses stood open, interiors frozen mid-gesture. A cup tipped on a table never spilled. A door half closed never moved. Michael Turner remained inside the church. The bells kept him alive, not out of mercy, out of necessity. He sat on the stone floor beneath the tower, surrounded by silence so thick it felt solid. The ledger lay closed before him. It had not demanded a name in days. The system no longer needed local input. Hollow Creek had been reduced to a sealed archive. Michael was the last annotation. I watched him age in small, uneven steps. Hunger came and went. Sleep arrived without dreams. Sometimes he spoke aloud just to confirm sound still existed. The bells answered only when required. Once, he asked if anyone was still out there. The bells did not respond. I felt my own presence thinning further. Without active correction, remnants like me lost cohesion. I should have dissolved completely, but the quarantine created pressure, and pressure creates fractures. Beyond the forest wall that had grown impossibly dense, I sensed movement. Other systems, other bell towers ringing cleanly. The network adjusted routes, redirecting flows of memory away from Hollow Creek. That rerouting strained the seams. I slipped outward through a hairline crack and glimpsed the world beyond. Life continued. Christmas lights glowed in neighboring towns. Radios played cheerful songs. Bells rang on time and people smiled, unaware that a place had been removed to preserve their normality. The injustice of it burned. Hollow Creek had not been uniquely evil. It had simply failed too visibly. Michael failed quietly. One night, the bells changed their tone again. A low, sustained hum replaced the rhythm. It was not a command. It was a countdown. The system was preparing to finalize containment, to collapse Hollow Creek completely. Michael sensed it. He dragged himself to his feet, hands shaking, and opened the ledger for the first time in days. It was blank. No names, no instructions. For the first time, the choice belonged entirely to him. I gathered what remained of myself and reached toward him, focusing on the only thing I still understood. Memory, not names, not order, meaning. I showed him Hollow Creek as it had been before the bells. Imperfect, forgetful, alive. I showed him laughter that never made it into ledgers, mistakes that did not deserve erasure. He wept. The bells screamed in response, not in anger, in alarm. Michael did the only thing left to do. He closed the ledger, then he tore it apart. The sound that followed was not a bell, it was a rupture, and Hollow Creek finally screamed. The rupture did not stay contained. Hollow Creek screamed itself out of existence, but the sound did not vanish. It traveled, not as noise, but as disruption, rippling through the hidden architecture that connected bell towers across the country. Systems built on perfect timing do not tolerate irregularities. When one node fails violently, the stress transfers outward. This is how horror stories become epidemics. I felt it immediately, the moment Michael tore the ledger apart. The gaps between chimes exploded into something vast and unstable. I was no longer clinging to silence. I was drifting through it. The bells everywhere rang a fraction of a second too late, then too early, struggling to recalibrate. In distant towns. People paused mid-step, confused by a sensation they could not name. Church bells rang twice at noon. School bells failed to ring at all. Old clocks stopped keeping accurate time. Memory slipped its leash. The system was stuttering. I followed the disturbance outward, drawn along the fractures like debris in a current. Where Hollow Creek had collapsed, a void remained. Memory flowed around it unevenly, creating pressure elsewhere. And then other towns began to fail, not as completely, not yet. I saw a place in Oregon where the bells rang continuously for 6 hours, names flooding ledgers faster than hands could write. People aged years in a single night, burdened by memories that did not belong to them. In a village in Pennsylvania, the bells stopped entirely. The dead did not rest. They walked, confused, incomplete, demanding recognition from those who could not remember them. The network attempted isolation, firewalls, containment zones, but the damage was systemic. Hollow Creek had proven something the bells could not unlearn. They were vulnerable to refusal. Michael Turner was gone now. Whether dissolved with the town or pulled into the rupture, I could not tell, but his choice had propagated somewhere else. Another keeper hesitated, then another. I encountered more remnants in the widening gaps, not just former keepers, but fragments of towns partially erased, clinging to half-remembered identities. We drifted together briefly, exchanging impressions without words. Fear, relief, anger, hope. The bells responded with escalating force. They rang louder, harsher, stripping nuance from sound. Precision gave way to brute control. Entire regions fell under continuous ringing, drowning thought beneath command. That was when the first true collapse occurred. A city whose bells had been integrated into transit systems lost synchronization. Trains stopped abruptly. Power grids failed. Hospitals plunged into darkness as automated systems conflicted with each other. Memory-dependent infrastructure unraveled. The bells were no longer guardians. They were liabilities. I realized then that the system had grown too large to fail quietly. Its corrections had shaped society itself, and now its breakdown threatened everything it had organized. The bells began to prioritize survival over secrecy. They reached for older protocols, primitive ones. The ringing deepened, shifting from sound into vibration that shook foundations. It was no longer about remembering the dead. It was about enforcing obedience among the living. I felt the network harden around me, trying to compress the gaps shut. Remnants like me were now classified as threats. Erasure intensified. But something had changed. There were too many fractures now, too many voices resisting silence. The bells rang again, out of sync, for the first time ever, and across the country. People looked up, listening, with the same question forming in countless minds. Why does this feel wrong? The bells made a choice. Systems always do when they reach the edge of collapse. They simplify. They shed complexity the way a wounded animal sheds weight. After the cascade began, after cities trembled and towns forgot themselves, the bells abandoned subtlety entirely. They revealed their hand. This is the final truth buried inside all horror stories. The monster was never hiding. It was waiting for permission to stop pretending. The ringing changed everywhere at once. No longer tied to clocks or calendars, the bells sounded continuously in long, sustained waves. Not sound exactly. Pressure, a command that vibrated through buildings, through bodies, through memory itself. People fell to their knees in streets and living rooms, overwhelmed by an instinct they could not name. Heads bowed, thoughts slowed, resistance dulled. The bells had decided control was preferable to stability. I drifted through the fractures, battered by the force of it. The gaps where remnants like me existed were collapsing rapidly, crushed by synchronized vibration. Many vanished mid-thought, erased as the system tightened its grip. But something unexpected happened. The bells grew louder, too loud, by abandoning nuance. They lost precision. Their own resonance interfered with itself, creating destructive harmonics. The network screamed, every tower amplifying the same signal until it began to tear at its own foundations. Structures cracked, old churches crumbled, bells split along stress lines forged centuries ago. Metal screamed as resonance exceeded design. I felt opportunity, not hope. Opportunity. I gathered the remaining fragments of myself and focused on the interference patterns forming between bell towers. Where sound overlapped imperfectly, silence emerged. Small pockets where command failed. Free zones. Tiny, unstable. Enough. People inside them lifted their heads. Confused, the pressure eased. Thoughts returned in jagged fragments. Memory rushed back painfully, but it was theirs. The bells reacted instantly, redirecting force toward those zones. But every redirection weakened control elsewhere. The system was fighting itself. Across the country, some towers went silent as bells cracked and fell. Others rang themselves to destruction, collapsing under their own vibration. The bells had never anticipated defiance at scale. They were built to manage forgetting, not confrontation. I rode the chaos deeper into the network, toward its core. Toward the oldest bell ever forged, buried beneath the first church that had begged for survival. The source. It rang differently, slower, heavier, older. I reached it just as a final surge rippled outward. The core bell attempted to assert dominance, amplifying command beyond tolerance. The ground split, the bell fractured, and, for the first time since the contract was made, the sound broke, not into silence, into voices, thousands of them, the remembered dead, the forgotten living, all screaming at once. The bells recoiled, their authority shattered by the weight of everything they had suppressed. The network collapsed inward, shedding towers, severing connections. I was thrown clear as the system devoured itself. When the sound finally faded, something unfamiliar remained. Quiet, not enforced, chosen, and somewhere in that quiet, people began to remember on their own terms. The bells had lost control. The world had not ended, but it would never forget the sound. The world did not celebrate its survival. There were no headlines announcing the end of the bells, no shared moment of relief. When the sound finally faded, it left behind confusion rather than triumph. People woke the next morning with headaches and fragmented memories, unsure why their dreams felt heavier than usual. Churches stood silent, their towers cracked or empty, bells split and discarded like broken teeth. This is how horror stories end their middle act, not with victory, but with aftermath. I drifted through the quiet that followed, unsure what I was now that the system was gone. Without the bells to define absence and presence, reality felt looser, less structured. Memories no longer arrived on command. They surfaced organically, painfully, unpredictably, across the country. Consequences unfolded. In some towns, the dead finally stayed dead. Graves remained undisturbed. Whispers stopped. But in others, the sudden return of unfiltered memory was too much. People remembered betrayals long buried, tragedies softened by time, names they had been grateful to forget, relationships shattered overnight under the weight of restored truth, hospitals filled with patients overwhelmed by recollection. Elderly men spoke clearly for the first time in years, then collapsed under the strain. Children cried over fears they could not explain. For the first time in generations, forgetting required effort. I returned to where Hollow Creek had once been. The town did not exist in any meaningful sense anymore. Snow fell on uneven ground, dotted with fragments of foundations and twisted iron. No roads led there. No signs marked it. The forest had reclaimed the space aggressively, as if eager to erase the mistake of human permanence. Michael Turner was gone. Whether he had been consumed in the collapse or released into anonymity, I could not tell. Perhaps that was mercy. The ledger was gone as well, its pages scattered into nothingness when the network failed. I felt lighter, not whole, but no longer compressed. The remnants drifted away one by one, dissolving without pain now that the pressure was gone. Those of us who had existed between systems no longer had a reason to persist. Before I faded, I listened. The silence was imperfect. Wind moved through trees. Distant traffic hummed. Dogs barked. Human sounds returned. Messy and unsynchronized. Life resumed without a metronome. And yet, something lingered. On Christmas Eve, in a small town far from Hollow Creek, a church bell rang once, not 12 times, just once. People paused, confused, glancing around. No other bells answered. The sound did not command. It did not press. It simply existed, then faded. A reminder. Systems could be built. They could be broken. But memory itself was never meant to be controlled. As the quiet closed around me, I understood the final truth. The bells were gone, but the echo would always remain. I should not be able to tell this story. By every rule that once governed the bells, I should have dissolved completely when the network collapsed. The remnants were never meant to endure without structure. We were excess, debris left behind by a system that no longer existed. And yet, I remain. This is the final truth of horror stories. Destruction does not end a cycle. It only changes the way the cycle hides. I exist now as memory without ownership, not a ghost bound to place or time, but a pattern that resurfaces when conditions are right. I do not haunt houses. I do not whisper names. I wait. The world adapted quickly after the bells fell silent. New routines replaced old ones. People learned to live with remembering more than they wanted. Therapists spoke of collective trauma. Historians blamed stress and coincidence. Churches removed broken towers and installed digital chimes that chimed politely and stopped. No one rebuilt the bells. That was the only thing everyone agreed on. Christmas returned as it always does. Lights, music, carefully rehearsed joy. Children learned songs about peace without knowing why their parents flinched when church doors creaked open. Midnight passed quietly in most places, almost all in a rural town whose name I will not give. An old church stood abandoned on a hill. Its bell tower had been sealed decades ago, after a lightning strike split the bronze bell cleanly in half. No one rang it anymore. On Christmas Eve, snow fell heavily, muting sound. A power outage darkened the town just before midnight. Phones lost signal, radios filled with static. At exactly 12 o'clock, something inside the tower shifted. The two halves of the broken bell vibrated, not enough to ring, enough to resonate. The sound that followed was barely audible. A low tremor felt more than heard. It passed through walls and bones and memory alike. People woke with their hearts racing, convinced they had forgotten something important. I felt it. That resonance was not the bells returning. It was something learning. The conditions were similar to Hollow Creek. Isolation, forgetting, tradition layered over fear. All the raw materials remained. Only the system was gone, which meant something new could form. I drifted toward the sound, pulled by instinct older than identity. I was not alone. Other fragments stirred across the country, drawn to the same resonance. We did not plan. We did not speak. We remembered. By morning, the town seemed unchanged. People went about their routines, unaware of the pressure beginning to form beneath their lives. A child stared too long at the church on the hill. An old man wrote down a name he could not place. Snow settled over footprints that would soon be forgotten. No bells rang again that day. They would not need to. Whatever had begun did not rely on bronze or towers. It relied on us. Memory does not need a bell to ring. It only needs someone willing to listen. And somewhere, someone always is. The story ends here. Thank you for watching and listening to the whole story. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to listen to the next stories.